So today I'm going to make a video hoping to shed some light on one of the most misunderstood numbers when it comes to Doppler radar kind of launch monitors and the data they provide. I'm going to be using an XI tour from FlightScope, but the same rules are going to apply to virtually all the Doppler radar launch monitors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make two seemingly completely opposite golf swings, and we're going to talk about some of the numbers they produce and then why they produce those numbers. That swing had a vertical swing plane of 48.1 degrees. That swing had a vertical swing plane of 49.7 degrees. So what was the point of those videos? Those videos are to show or illustrate that the vertical swing plane has absolutely nothing to do with the shaft plane. In those videos, the ones where the hands were the lowest at impact actually had a higher vertical swing plane number than the swing where my hands were much higher at impact. We're going to talk about the reason why, and then talk about actually what the vertical swing plane is measuring, what it means, and how things aren't always what they seem. So the vertical swing plane is measuring the vertical part of the path the club head is traveling on. Meaning, so if we had a plane border, you trace the arc of the club head, it's showing the vertical component of the path of the sweet spot. But it's measuring the club head. The shaft has absolutely nothing to do with it, and in some ways, they're inverse of one another. Not all the time, but in many instances, they're actually the opposite of what you would expect to see. So there's a lot of people making videos or talking about TrackMan, FlightScope, all the Doppler radar launch monitors, and talking about how the vertical swing plane, and then drawing lines, kind of illustrating the shaft plane. Those two don't necessarily and really don't correlate with one another at all. They sometimes do, which would mean when the plane of the shaft and the club head or the sweet spot are traveling pretty much in the same plane, meaning that the hands and the club are both moving relatively on the same planes. But in many golf swings, most golfers aren't swinging on plane, so to speak, where the club head is often either steep or above the plane the hands are traveling on, or in a lot of good players, the club head is actually below the plane the hands are traveling on. In these instances, the vertical swing plane would actually be inverse to the shaft plane. By that I mean, so best to show an example is as you come down, so in this instances, my hands could be very low, which a lot of people could take as having a very low vertical swing plane. But you notice the club head is above my hands, and it's kicking outside my hands. So if you actually look at not the path of my hands, but the club head, that club head's actually coming down vertically, almost on the target line. There's not much of an arc to this. So the vertical swing plane of that swing would probably be somewhere around 70 degrees if I basically went up the plane. And there's actually, you'll see several good players who are generally really steep do something similar to this, where the club head kicks outside their hands, but they stay down and get their hands really low, and the club head stays on the target line. These guys are going to tend to be steep, hit lots of low poles, have trouble getting the ball elevated. More common, you see it with high handicap golfers, is the club starts kicking outside their hands, and they actually will stand up. But standing up and actually making the shaft plane higher is actually going to lower the vertical swing plane relative where it was before. And the reason for that is because as your wrist uncocked, the club head starts becoming lower than the hands. So watch this. If I was standing up and early extending, like a lot of amateurs do, so I stand up in the downswing, this club gets behind me. So even though my hands are really high and would be really high at impact, you're going to see that the vertical part of this plane, the sweet spot's actually traveling on a very flat angle to the golf ball. More like 30 degrees. Versus this one where my hands are really low, but the club head is traveling barely on an arc and almost linear to the golf ball, much more vertical than horizontal, is going to be much higher swing plane angle. So in those demonstration videos I did where I hit a ball, in the low hands one, my hands got really low at impact, but the club head was kicking outside my hands, meaning the club head was moving more over the target line, getting over the target line sooner, which is actually why it resulted in a higher vertical swing plane number. In the other swing, my hands, the club head was actually under my hands, and even though my hands were going up and raising and getting very high impact, the club head was approaching from a very shallow angle. So it gave a very low vertical swing plane number. So my hands were very high at impact, yet the vertical swing plane was just under 50, right around what PGA Tour averages. Where this gets into swing faults and fault correction is that you could have a very high vertical swing plane number. You identify that and basically go, and you might have a steep angle of attack. So you're like, I'm going to shallow my swing, try to get my hands lower at impact. The problem with that is unless you get the club head more behind your hands and more level with your hands, you're not actually going to shallow your angle of attack, and you're not actually going to lower your vertical swing plane number. Is that you could sit here and try to lower your hands, but if when you lower your hands, this club kind of what we call tips over, so the club becomes vertical as you lower your hands, which is very common. As my hands lower, the club wants to rotate, the club wants to kick out. This actually makes the sweet spot, not the grip, but or the shaft, but the sweet spot travel very vertically, which would be a very high vertical swing plane number. So the biggest thing to understand here is that the vertical swing plane is not the shaft plane, and in many instances where the player's off plane, so the club head's traveling kind of from above the hands and tipping over, or going from under the hands out to the golf ball, it's actually as their hands get higher, the sweet spot for the guy where the club's head's traveling under the hands, the higher his hands get, so the more he uncocks his wrist, the closer the club head's getting to the ground at the same point, which means it can travel more from the inside if he makes solid contact, and as he's turning, it's going to come back around. So the guy that actually has the club head below his hands is swinging on a bigger arc or a lower vertical swing plane number than the guy who has the club way above his hands and kicking out, and then is going to tend to stick the club on the ground and stand up, is his club's going to work very linear. So you have a guy with low hands at impact with a high vertical swing plane, or you can have high hands at impact with a very low vertical swing plane. They are not the same, and you cannot look at a number in isolation. You have to look at the golf swing as a whole. And that's really the point of the video, is that you can't chase a singular number, is that all the numbers relate to one another, and how you release the golf club can drastically change those numbers, and many times what you see on camera won't necessarily match the numbers on the flight scope. I can make a golf swing where my hands would be very high in impact, yet I'd have a vertical swing plane of 45 degrees and it would look kind of like it's very shallow. I would actually hit up on the golf ball, but most people would see that impact and think I was very upright or steep. Inversely, I could come down, have very low hands at impact, but actually come down very steeply, take massive divots, and have a very high vertical swing plane number. You can't just look at the numbers You have to match the numbers to the video and be good enough at understanding the numbers to kind of see how everything correlates and works together. But you cannot chase numbers. And I would actually say, if anything, the vertical swing plane's the most misunderstood and not used number. And it's not that it's not important, it's that so few people actually know what it's measuring and how it's measured that they don't know how to use it. Is that it actually very closely correlates to how you release the golf club. So it doesn't matter whether the hands are high or low, how the club head's approaching the golf ball is how it's measured. So the sweet spot of the club head. And you can see how someone releases the club is gradually going to make the vertical swing plane either steeper or shallower. And it has a big impact on whether someone can draw or fade the ball. Generally, when they get to two extremes, you generally are going to only be able to hit the ball one direction. You're either going to tend to hit it really high and take big divots and be pretty steep, or you're going to, with a lot of spin, so you're going to launch it low, very spinny, or you're going to tend to hit it a little bit low on the face, not take a divot, launch the ball pretty high because you're going to be very shallow with the handle very high, but you're going to tend to hit knuckleballs that don't have enough spin. Ideal is somewhere in between, and that's where a lot of guys get confused. So if someone has a good golf swing, the shaft plane and the vertical swing plane will be very close together, and they will be very similar. But that's only the case on good golf swings where the hands and club are traveling relatively similar paths. Is when the club head starts getting way off plane and traveling on a completely different arc than the hands are, is there's no correlation at all. So vertical swing plane is the path of the sweet spot. Club head has nothing to do with the shaft plane and very closely correlates to how someone releases the club. So meaning that how quickly their wrist uncock versus roll. So someone that uncocks their wrist early is going to get the club head below their hands, and then they rotate and roll the club to the ball. It's going to have a very shallow angle of attack. It's going to have a very low vertical swing plane number. Someone that keeps their wrist cocked while rotating, which makes this club tip over, is going to actually have higher vertical swing plane numbers, be very steep, but they'd actually have lower hands at impact than the first golfer would. Hopefully this clears some things up and makes this often misunderstood number or data point a little more clear.